Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. We are here again this week to talk about happiness and the science behind it. And today's topic, I bet a lot of us think about on the daily. It is about loosening the grip of regret and worry. And our guest today in the virtual studio is from a very different place on the planet. I'll get her to introduce herself in a little bit. But by way of introduction, Beth Kurland, Ph.D, is a clinical psychologist, public speaker, and author of 3 books, including Dancing on the Tightrope, Transcending the Habits of Your Mind, and Awakening to Your Fullest Life. Beth has been in clinical practice since 1994 and provides evidence-based treatment to people across the lifespan, with a focus on using mindfulness and mind-body strategies. To enjoy free meditations and other resources, visit bethkurland.com. Now, there's a disclaimer at the beginning of this episode, and I think this is important for our audience to know before we start the conversation. The information in this episode does not take into account your specific objectives, mental health state, or needs. This content is intended purely for educational purposes only and is not intended as psychological advice or intervention of any kind. If you require mental health assistance, it's always best to consult with a licensed professional. So hi, Beth. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to have a very good time, I'm sure of that. And before we do that, please introduce a bit more about yourself to our audience and your professional journey.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Professional journey. So where do I start? I guess I think back to when I was in high school. Actually, right up until that point, I thought I wanted to be a writer. I loved writing poetry when I was a child and doing creative writing. So that was my first dream. And then in 11th grade, I took a social psychology class. And as part of that class, we were paired with younger students from the middle school. And we were essentially a mentor for them. And so I got to work with another student and just meet with them weekly and mentor them. And between that and the content in the psychology class, I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. And it really spoke to me. And also during that time, my mom had died when I was 15. And so I was dealing with my own grief during that as well. And I think I was drawn to psychology for a lot of reasons, in part because I wanted to help people. I think in part in terms of just working through my own grief at that time. And I also should say, and come out later as well, but I am by nature wired kind of high stress with a good bit of anxiety mixed in there too. So I think there are a lot of reasons why the profession of psychology called to me. And so I really then went to graduate school, and it was a pretty straight path. But what I will say about part of my journey that I feel is so essential is that very early on, I really gravitated towards mind-body practices, and mindfulness meditation being one of them, and other kinds of mind-body practices are really just embodied that gets us out of the head and more into the whole body. And those have been so transformative for me in my own life. And also then really bringing those into working with my patients and clients over the years. So it's something I'm really passionate about.
Yeah,
and then I'll just say that I got to do my writing. After my daughter went to college, I started writing some books. So got to kind of live out 2 dreams here. It was very fun.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Oh, I really love hearing stories, and your story as well is a beautiful one because you get to do both.
Yes.
Initially you wanted to write, and now here you are writing. So, kind of
Yeah.
you have different ways of getting there, and your way of getting there is also a great one. So in the context of today's conversation, we're going to talk a lot about uh, regret and worry, and these are things that we think about on a daily basis. I would say, human by nature, we
Hmm.
think about, we kind of gravitate towards thinking about the past or the future, and not a lot in the present, I would say,
Hmm.
which is why, like, I think this topic is so timely, and it's always going to be timely. Whenever our audience tunes into this episode, I think, I'm sure they'll get some sort of help there. But I'm curious about why you would like to talk about this topic in particular, because obviously in your work you have a broad spectrum of things you've covered. I'm sure you've worked with a lot of different people. So why did this topic emerge to be one of the things that you really want to talk about on this show?
So I think one of the things that you were really touching upon is this mental habit that we have of the mind to wander into either the future or to get stuck in the past. And so, and we all experience this. And when we can, it's normal for that to happen. And of course, there are some useful things about that happening. But when we get stuck on either end, it can create a lot of suffering for us when we get stuck in either worry or in regret. And so I really am interested in, understanding and really looking at, and I know we'll probably get into this a little bit, some of the mental habits that our mind can get caught in, and how do we work with that, and how do we work through that to cultivate deeper well-being. So it's just
Yeah.
I think something very much that all of us can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And we'll talk about that in further detail in our main interview questions.
Yeah.
But right now, let's talk about you. There's a section at the beginning of every single podcast that is called Have You Met Beth? Obviously, not the same name for all the guests, but you get the drill. Each
Yeah.
guest will give us some recommendations, so we get to know them a bit better. And these are my favorite questions as well, because I get to know not only about the guest, but also about something new each time, because we get a lot of different kinds of recommendations. The first question is, what is a book you would recommend?
So let's see. I love all the books on my bookshelf. But one that I find myself that I keep going back to, and this is actually a wonderful book to listen to as well, is a book by Deb Dana called Befriending Your Nervous System. And I am very passionate about really understanding how let me frame it this way. When we understand our nervous system, it can really empower us in a lot of ways. And she does such a beautiful job of really laying out in really relatable language these different pathways of our nervous system, and giving a lot of practical exercises and tools to really work with how do we regulate our nervous system so that we could really find deeper well-being. And it's a beautiful book, and I love her narration as well. So that's a book that I find that I can listen to or read, repeatedly and get something out of it each time. And I guess, and I would say it's just to put in a little plug for the books that I wrote that I'm really excited about sharing with people. Each one has a different angle on well-being. And so I know just for the audience that is listening to your show, that whole topic of well-being, I really try to touch on in different ways. So, so just throw that out there too.
Yeah. Sounds wonderful. Thank you for that. Sounds great. What about a movie you would recommend?
So I guess the movie that comes to mind is right off the top here is one that I saw a couple of years ago. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called CODA, CODA.
No, I haven't.
And it stands for...
Someone mentioned that the other day.
Yeah, it stands for Child of a Deaf Adults. And it's a beautiful, beautiful movie that is so poignant. And it's about a young woman who is in high school, ready to go off out into the world. and she is growing up in a home with both her parents are deaf and her brother is deaf. And she becomes quite passionate about music and about singing. And this is obviously something she's not able to share with her family members in that way because they can't, hear her singing. But it's just so beautifully done. It's very touching, and kind of a coming of age story, but so much more than that. And what I really love, it's just really uplifting. So I would recommend that for somebody looking for an uplifting movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I really thought it was about something else, but when you kind of explain where that was taking us, I was like, oh, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, I'll put that on my list for sure. So you're our podcast guest of the day, but I wonder which podcast you would recommend.
So I would say there's a lot of podcasts that I've listened to over the recent years. The one that comes to mind most for me, I think, is the Sounds True podcast. Insights at the Edge is what it's called. It's produced by Sounds True, and Sounds True actually publishes a lot of books. And so on this podcast, they interview different authors that they have published, who have published with Sounds True. And I found myself, especially during the pandemic, really listening to this because I wanted some inspiration. And I love the people who are interviewed. There's a really interesting blend of psychology and spirituality and personal growth and all of that. And so I found it, and I still find it. But again, I'm thinking I really started listening to it a lot during the pandemic when I was trying to nurture my own well-being.
Yeah. Wow. Very interesting recommendation. Thank you. Yeah. Next question is about your role model. Now, this could be a famous person or just your personal role model. It doesn't have to be a famous person. Who would that role model be for you?
Sure. So I have a couple of people that I have a lot of people, so I'll try to narrow it down to a few. But I would say in terms of maybe famous people in my world, Tara Brach is somebody who I really love her spiritual teaching and her wisdom. Rick Hansen is another person who I've been greatly influenced by in terms of his spiritual and psychological teaching and the way that he merges an understanding of neuroscience with spirituality and psychology. And what I love about them, and I would throw Deb Dana in there too, who I mentioned as the author of the book, Befriending Your Nervous System. She's not so much a spiritual teacher, but all three of them I look up to so much as role models because they really embody what they teach. And that just comes across so much in the way that they speak and the way that they carry themselves and how authentic they are and just really sharing their own personal stories and journeys. And so those are three people that really inspire me.
Oh, I love that. Not just one person, but multiple people. And I think that's a new thing that's emerged on this podcast. A lot of our recent guests have said that, they don't just have one role model because they embody and learn different things from different people. And I think that's like the really nice thing about having all these wonderful people in the world. You can just sort of pick up something from anyone, and I think, your role models must be really personal to you. And thank you for sharing that. Final question is, what is a course you've completed that left a really strong impact on you?
So I just completed a course in the past year. There was a wonderful course. I believe the title was called the Play Zone Pro Certificate class. So it's really all about using polyvagal theory in coaching and helping people, bringing polyvagal theory into working with clients and whatever their goals, whether it be more sports coaching. The person who teaches this is very much into coaching professional athletes, but it can really be brought into all aspects of health and wellness. And so I found that course really, really helpful in terms of, again, understanding the nervous system and how that underlies everything we do. And I would also, I just throw out one other course that I took, which was Rick Hanson's positive neuroplasticity trainings. He did an initial training and a professional training. I did both of those, and they were absolutely wonderful, and very much integrating those things into my work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You must be really you must really love learning, and the courses that you talked about, they sounds really wonderful to me. I just love hearing about these different courses that professionals take, because you would think that when you're really into a field, you're probably just going to do more research and like expand on your work. But to hear that you're so experienced, you've written so many books, yet you're still learning new things, I think that's really inspiring. So thank you for sharing all of that.
You're welcome.
We have now covered all of them. We've covered the 5 questions, get 5 things that you recommend and you would like to share about. So I think by this point, our audience have got to know you a bit better. And it's time to talk about today's topic, which is loosening the grip of regret and worry. The show is about happiness. So we always ask our guests the first question about happiness first, to set the scene before we go into anything else. So Beth, what does happiness mean to you?
So that's a bit of a loaded question, because it's interesting. I have another book coming out in the new year. And in this book, at the beginning, I really talk about happiness versus well-being. And so I really prefer the word well-being. And I'll say a little bit more. I think there are 2 kinds of happiness, at least that the research talks about. There's more hedonic happiness and there's eudaimonic happiness. So hedonic happiness is more of that short-term pleasure, kind of happy feeling that we often think of and associate with happiness. But the eudaimonic happiness is more about long-term well-being, satisfaction, meaning, purpose. And so the reason why I prefer the word well-being is that I think in the culture that I've grown up in, there's a lot of emphasis more on this hedonic version of happiness as a little bit more of a quick fix, or a sense of, we should be happy all the time. So what I find about well-being is, and it's just a matter of semantics, maybe, but this idea that happiness is kind of dependent on mood, that we think of it as a mood, whereas well-being is something that we can cultivate no matter what we're feeling. So we could be sad, but still have a deep sense of well-being. So I guess just to say a little bit more about the definition of that, I think of it when we can rest in a calm, regulated nervous system, and when we can step out of this mental chatter of our mind, that well-being naturally emerges. And so from that place, we can settle into the presence of what is actually here, and bringing awareness to the present moment, and also bringing a sense of compassion. I think when we're able to bring some compassion and acceptance to what's here, that we can really find that well-being, or maybe that eudaimonic happiness.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it is a loaded question, isn't it? The more you talk about it, the more I'm like, yep, that's a lot of information. And it's interesting because at LMSL we have 2 shows that I'm hosting. One is this one about happiness. The other one is about well-being. In fact, we have a total of 10 shows, but there are 2 shows about these 2 topics. And I love these topics, which is why I'm here. But the more that I host the 2 shows, the more that I realize that there's this overlap between happiness and well-being. And they are sometimes the same thing. Sometimes they are very different things. I still don't know what happiness is. I also don't know what well-being is. If you ask me to define it, it changes every single week. Perhaps even every day, the definition of happiness and well-being. But it's so interesting when you mention that anchor of being in the present moment, because I have found that to be like a recurring theme in both shows. So I would say probably at least 60% of the guests on both shows talk about the practice of being mindful, being present. And if there's anything that's kind of not going right in your life, or if you want to boost your happiness or well-being, your mindfulness, meditation, being in the present moment, that's like the number one thing that's recommended by everyone. So yeah, that's kind of where we're going with today's topic as well, because I think we're gonna drive it back to that.
Definitely.
So your definition is not. I would say it's not one definition. It's like a multitude of things that we need to consider, but it's so interesting. It leaves a lot of food for thought. But I'm now curious about the other end of the story. Like, on the other side, we have things that people get wrong about happiness. Obviously, you've sort of shared a little bit about happiness, the way that you think about happiness and well-being. But I find that when I talk to guests about this particular aspect of happiness, there are things that emerge that I find to be new. So things that a lot of people just sort of think of as happiness, and turns out they're not bringing you happiness at all. And we call them misconceptions. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions you've noticed that people have when it comes to happiness?
I think one misconception that can say get people in trouble, meaning create some suffering, is a sense that we need to be happy all the time. And that somehow if we're not happy, there's something wrong with us. And I see a lot of people struggling with a lot of big things in their lives who might come in and say, what's wrong with me? I'm not feeling happy. And I think social media can really pull for some of this, where you could look at other people's social media accounts and the photos, and people look on the surface like they're happy. And so you look at, well, what's wrong with me that my life isn't like that? So I think there can be this pressure or striving to be happy. And happiness is, don't get me wrong, I think it's, wonderful to feel, and something that I hope that we all can experience much of the time. But I think when it comes at the expense of other emotions, it can be more troubling. And so partly I'm thinking of this because this book, again, that's coming out in the new year, is a lot about how do we really work with difficult emotions. So I think there needs to be really room for both of those. Yeah. And that can it be okay if we're not feeling happy all the time, and how do we work with that too?
Yeah.
So,
so true. Yeah, I really love that. I think quite a few guests have mentioned that in different words, I would say, or, some people say it in the exact same words. But what I have found for myself personally, right, I've heard this quite a few times, but I found it interesting because I agree with you completely. And the other day, I want to throw in this little story because it's funny. The other day I was talking to a friend, and I was kind of like, I was really down. I was like really tired, sad about a lot of things. And I was like, I hate this feeling. Why can't my life just be normal? And then he went, but don't you think that'll be boring? And I was like, you're right. Yes, it is uncomfortable. It's not fun, but in a way, yes. And there's a concept that I've picked up recently that I really love, which is post-traumatic growth. And it's never fun to go through trauma, ever. It's never fun to be sad, to feel down. Personally, that's for me, and I know for a lot of people too. But I think it's so interesting when you can have that perspective, right? It's fine to not feel happy all the time. It's fine to feel completely not happy right now, because something good will come out of it. Obviously, don't dismiss your feeling. Like, that's what I tell myself. Don't dismiss your feeling. Just feel it. But it's okay. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really important story, and again, for people to hear that and to know that, none of us feel happy all the time, and that's normal and that's okay. And that's where I think, and I remember for myself during the pandemic, I found myself a lot of times saying, I wish I could feel happy like I had been feeling prior. And what I found was that even when happiness wasn't there, I could still cultivate well-being no matter what I was experiencing. I think the other thing about happiness that I would say is that sometimes we think we need to wait for our life circumstances to change in order to be happy. When I get that new job or when I get this new purchase or whatever, then I'll be happy. And I think it's really important to think about it more again as something that we can cultivate from within, that isn't dependent on external circumstances as much as our mindset and how we approach whatever's here.
Yeah, 100%. I really love that because it goes right back to being present and enjoying the present and being mindful. And the other thing that I didn't mention before, but I want to throw that in now, is gratitude.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait for something new and grand to happen for us to be grateful for what we already have. And it's just so tiny. It's such a tiny thing that everyone can do, right? And it's so funny. I went camping over the weekend and I told my friend, how's the food? Do you like it? And then he's like, yeah, it's all right. I was like, no. Be grateful. It's so good, isn't it? Isn't it amazing how it tastes? And in a way, I was like, okay, maybe I'm a bit annoying, but I think it was really fun to kind of share with other people and in a way to be grateful together and, like get everyone else to feel excited about little things right there and then. So like when I talk to another friend, I'll be like, isn't this book amazing? Don't you love it? I love it. And then just talk about it right there. And, in a way, it's kind of like the gratitude of that, present moment. It really helps because sometimes I think we don't talk about good things that are happening right at that moment. We are probably talking about something in the past or in the future. And that's why we're here to talk about today's topic.
I love that. That's very powerful. There's so much powerful research on gratitude. And I think sometimes just those mini moments can make such a difference. And also there's a little bit of contagiousness around that in a positive way.
Yeah, 100%. So, we've covered a lot about, staying in the present, being grateful, having that mindfulness in what we're doing in this very moment. But as we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, we have this tendency as human to look back or look forward instead of look at what's happening right now, right there and then. Which is why we have the concept of regret and worry. As I said to you, before we started the recording, I was like, you know what, maybe we should set the scene for our audience because everyone knows about regret and worry. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
We've all talked about this as humans, but how should we look at regret and worry today for the context of this particular conversation? What kinds of regret and what kinds of worry are we talking about?
Yeah, there's such a continuum of that, isn't there? Because we have our little minor day-to-day irritations or things that, just a little minor thing. We might regret that we forgot to pick something up at the grocery store. I don't know. But then we have those much deeper regrets, looking back at different parts of our lives and regretting maybe ways that we acted or things that happened at that time. So it really does fall on such a wide continuum. And I think worry as well, in terms of just being worried about more day-to-day minor things. And I'm sure some listeners out there and many, many people have pretty big worries about some very real challenges that they might be facing in their lives. So I'm not sure I would limit the conversation that we're going to have here to either or. I think that it could probably speak to anywhere along that continuum. I will say this, though, for more of those extreme things, either on the worry end or the regret end, and I'll probably, maybe this will come up again, but I do think it's important for people to know that it's okay to get help and it's okay to, to get professional help if people really feel stuck in regret or worry. And that I just wanted to throw that out there because sometimes it's way bigger than us and the kinds of situations we're dealing with are way bigger than us. And it can be really helpful to have, somebody to really talk to and work through that that's a professional.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've totally agree with that, and I couldn't agree more, because I think there's a stigma against, getting help, right? And we're talking about, as you said, it's a continuum, it's a spectrum of things. There's so many kinds of regrets and worry, and sometimes we tend to discount the things that we think would be, that's not that big. I don't have to worry about it, but then it's constantly playing in your mind in a loop, and it, before you know it, it affects you. And so I think the importance of getting help when you really struggle, and when you feel like, okay, I've been playing in this loop for too long, or like it's impacting my ability to enjoy my life, or function, then yeah, professional help is very important. And there's no shame in that, because a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to say to my family or my colleagues that I am getting counseling or getting therapy, or getting professional help, because it sounds like I'm weak. In fact, I don't think so. It shows strength. It shows a lot of strength to work on yourself.
Absolutely. And having sat with people for over 30 years now in my own practice, I really believe that so wholeheartedly. And as somebody who myself personally have benefited greatly from therapy at different points in my own life. So I think that's really important point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's important to start the conversation this way, because whatever we are going to discuss will probably just be, part of the big picture, because a lot of people will be going through this in different ways. And so my next question to you would be, how would our regret and worry affect our happiness and well-being? Because we're talking about the fact that, it's so important to understand it and, get help when you need it. But yeah, our perspectives, and then, you as a professional, me as an ordinary person learning about this topic, we might have things to add to the table. So I wonder, from your perspective, how does that work in terms of the relationship between regret and worry and happiness? I know it's not going to be a fun one, because obviously when you have a lot of regret and worry, your level of happiness might be impacted, and because you're not in the present. But what is more to it? Maybe there's some research to back it up. If there's anything that's interesting that our audience should know, I would love for you to share that.
Well, what I would say is that I think those are feeling regret and feeling worry are normal human experiences that we all have. The challenge comes in when we get stuck there. And I think that's really the distinction that I want to emphasize here, that some amount of worry and regret to a point could potentially be useful. And I'll just share briefly around that. Say with worry, if I'm worried about coming onto this podcast today and worried about, oh my gosh, am I going to know what to talk about or whatever? There are some things I can do about that. I can prepare. I can think about what I want to share. If I'm worried about being overwhelmed about some future event, there may be steps I can take. So I think that's important. And with regret, I think there's some healthy amount of regret, I would say, or ways that it can maybe benefit our well-being. And I want to be careful because I think it's limited, but I do think there's a few things that are useful to think about. But if something happened in the past and we can learn from that experience, then that is something we can take away that we can bring forward with us and say, okay, I've learned from that. And now that's going to change my behavior. That's going to change my choices going forward. So in that way, regret in a small dose could actually benefit our well-being going forward. If regret allows us to take some action in the future, that's another way that can be helpful. I'll share a story, somebody that I'm thinking of who had a falling out with their family. And one of these situations, it was kind of over a minor thing, but basically these different members of their family completely stopped talking to each other for years. And one of those family members was really reflecting back on and feeling this regret about what happened and about having lost connection. And they took an action step and they reached out after all these years later, and really apologized and cleared the air. And they have since reconnected. And it's really been quite transformative in a positive way. So another example how some healthy doses can be helpful. I think one other example with regret, I think about thinking about regret in advance, that if I can, stand where I am now and say, am I going to regret looking back on this moment if I didn't do X, Y, or Z? That can also be useful in guiding us towards what choices we want to make. A little quick story on that comes to mind. This was during the pandemic, and I was pretty extremely cautious about any traveling or anything like that I did. But my son, who at that time was in his last year of college, and he had a big national tournament that his ultimate Frisbee team made. They were playing in California. So I had, would require me to fly totally across the country. And it was right when the Omicron virus was coming out, and there was not a lot known about it. And so in that moment, me being able to reflect back and say, would I regret not going, it because of fear? And my answer was yes. I don't want to have that regret. So, I made that choice to go. That was, but I think when we get stuck, the other end of it, right, is that when we get stuck in it, it consumes so much energy, and we can, it can take up resources. It could take up mental resources. It could take up even physiological resources being stuck in that. And so we miss out on our lives, and it can be hard to then move forward. And sometimes we can get caught in guilt and shame and self-criticism and blame and those kinds of things. And that tends to sometimes just keep us stuck in this spiral, and it's hard to move forward from. Yeah, so I'm not sure 100%. If I answered the question there, but kind of.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. You did. I think it's so important to get that reminder that it's kind of like you need a healthy dose of each. You need a healthy dose of regret, and you need a healthy dose of worry. And it's so hard to find that balance, but I think that's why we're here to talk about this topic, right? Because we need to constantly look at what that healthy dose looks like, because a lot of people get stuck, like you said, and I'm sure if they are tuning into this episode, chances are they're probably stuck right now in either regret or worry, and either is not fun. So let's talk a bit more about that, because I think this is where it gets really fun. I think any mental work is fun for me, even if I'm feeling really uncomfortable. If I get the right tool and I can think about it in a different perspective, it's really helpful. So in your book, Dancing on the Tightrope, I love that title, by the way. You sort of discuss transcending the habits of the mind. Now, I would love to hear more about this, especially when it comes to letting go of regret and worry, because I'm one of those people that are probably anxious by nature. I think ahead a lot, and sometimes I can get stuck in my regret as well, especially if something major happens, or if I look back and I'm like, oh, I should have done that or this and that. And at the moment, I'm kind of struggling with both. So maybe I'm the perfect person to talk to you about this today and help our audience to relate to it. But that concept of transcending the habits of the mind sounds so interesting to me, because if I can do that, I can find that healthy dose that we just talked about. So how does that work in practice?
Yeah. And I think a big step is understanding the nature of our mind and understanding these mental habits that we all can get stuck in. Because when we can see it, then we can have ways of navigating around it and through it. So I'll share some of the mental habits that I talk about, and then I'll try to connect them to those regret and to worry. So the first mental habit that I talk about is what I call the false alarm. And this is really about physiologically what happens in our body when we come up against threat. So we have this part of our nervous system that's constantly scanning for cues of danger and threat, or for cues of safety. And think back to, Stone Age ancestors, right? The saber-toothed tigers. And so we are wired, and this is often below surface of our conscious awareness even, that when we perceive cues of threat, our whole body activates in these protective circuits get activated that can bring us into fight, flight, or more into a freeze or shutdown response. And while that was protective for our ancestors and is protective at points, if I'm walking across the street and a car's coming at me too fast, I want my fight or flight response to, I want to be able to kind of react really quickly. My heart rate goes up and my whole stress response gets turned on, and stress chemicals get dumped in my body to move me out of the way really fast. But what can happen is we can get stuck in this response even when it is not always the one that is going to be most helpful for resolving what's actually going on. So that fight-flight response tends to be when we, at least for myself, and I like you, tend to be a worrier, or thinking more about the future a lot, and I definitely can get stuck there. So sometimes my nervous system can go into this fight-flight mode, and I'm feeling all this grip of anxiety and worry when there's actually that is not going to help me solve whatever the problem is in that moment. And even during the global pandemic, of which I think so many of us felt a great deal of worry, when I could recognize that, okay, this is the nature of my mind, to go into this stress mode and hold on a second, is this really helping me meet this moment right now? And when I could understand what's happening in my nervous system and say, okay, well, yes, this is normal. This is an adaptive response, and it's not maybe the response that's actually most needed in this moment. It helped me to loosen the grip a little bit by being able to step back. I think with regret, sometimes we can get stuck more in that shutdown response of the nervous system, that protective response of shutdown, where then it may be harder to move forward. It may, we feel more immobilized. And so again, just understanding the nature of our nervous system can give us a little bit of perspective. So it's kind of like just taking that half step back and then being able to ask, is this response the one that's actually most protective right now in this moment? Is it the one that's most helpful right now in this moment? So that's just a quick little dip into the false alarm. Another mental habit that really relates pretty directly to what we're talking about is what I call the stuck dial. And so if you think about a dial with kind of this on-off setting, that one setting is in mind-wandering mode, and the other setting is that we're completely present, engaged in the present moment. It turns out that our minds can be stuck in this mind-wandering mode. One study estimates that about 50% of the time we're actually focused on something other than what's here right now. So if you think about it, that's half our lives, that our mind is wandering into the past or into the future. And when we can begin to notice the nature of our mind to do that, and mindfulness meditation is certainly one really helpful way of doing that. It's not the only way, but it's certainly a very helpful way. Again, that noticing can help us course correct a little bit. If I'm sitting at a dinner, and this happened recently with a bunch of friends, and all of a sudden my mind is running into the future. Oh my God, I've got to travel in a few weeks, and how am I going to get all this done? And if I could catch myself and recognize, hold on, wait a second. Here I am at this dinner with my friends, and my mind just ran ahead, like a runaway train. And so just that noticing that is the invitation to come back to what's here, but also to not judge oneself. It's, oh, yes, that is the nature of the mind. That's what our mind's going to, will do. And when we understand that, it can also be empowering. It can help us to really notice these mental habits and work with them.
Wow,
so
that's powerful.
Yeah. There's I'll throw out another mental habit, and this one touches into something a little bit that you mentioned earlier, but we have a negativity bias. So I call this the Velcro problem, and it's affectionately named after Rick Hanson's the way that he talks about this. He says our mind is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. So the positive things are like slip away, like the slippery surface of Teflon, and these negative experiences can really stick. And that is, again, that is the nature of our mind. That is part of our human condition. And we were wired that way through evolution with some good, adaptive reasons for that. But in our modern day lives, we can get stuck in negativity. And, that could come up with regret, right? When something happened in the past, but now I'm fixated on that. And that's all I'm thinking about. And it's consuming all of my mental energy. And if that's happening, then I'm missing out on all of these things that are maybe positive things that are also here that my brain is not noticing or focusing on. And so, again, being able to understand the nature of the mind can really allow us to work with it. And you mentioned gratitude earlier. And I think gratitude is such a lovely way of working with this Velcro problem, because it's really looking for, like, what are these little moments that I can appreciate? And if I'm stuck in regret about something in the past, can I really look for these little moments? Is there something that I can really take in and appreciate about what's happening right now in my life that I can focus on so as not to be consumed by the past?
Yeah. That analogy of the Velcro problem is really interesting, because I'm like, yeah, you know what? It's kind of true when you think about your own life. It's just, I think about my life too. Now that you've said it, I'm like, there are a lot of good things happening, but sometimes I just sit there in the past, not regret per se, but try to understand, analyze it. Perhaps that comes with a little bit of regret as well. Like, I should have done this differently, or I should not have done that. But I think mainly is the sticking with the bad experiences and not really enjoying the good ones. So yeah, again, like, gratitude is so important in this scenario, and I think it's helpful for everyone to keep that in mind. But let's talk a bit more about regret. So we have regret and worry. We have, two sides of the coin, or two different ends of the spectrum, however you want to call it. But let's talk about, first of all, regret. So as we said, a healthy dose of regret is good, but a lot of people get stuck. So why do you think a lot of people get stuck in that regret? And once they have realized the why, how can they get out of that and overcome that?
So, I think in terms of why people get stuck in regret, I'm not sure that I have any one answer for that. I will say that sometimes I think that people feel, at least a part of them feels that, if I stay stuck here, and part of that is being stuck in self-criticism, or it might be being stuck in some blame or something like that, self-blame sometimes, that it's going to somehow help me in some misguided way, that it's going to, prevent me from doing this thing again. And I think that's a misconception. I think that, in fact, self-criticism, sometimes we think we need to beat ourselves up in order to be the person we want to be, And I think that the opposite is true, that when we get stuck in self-criticism or blame or shame or that kind of thing, that it really can keep us stuck. So self-compassion is a big piece here, I think, in working with, really, it has its place for worry as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
But in working with regret, how can we accept our own humanness, our own imperfections, and our common humanity, and have that kind of self-compassion that allows us to be kind to ourselves the way that we would be kind to somebody else going through a situation. So a really common thing that people can grasp sometimes is, if they're stuck in regret, and just being able to say, well, if this situation were happening to a dear friend of yours, how would you think about it? And it's often very different than, they would say, well, it would be, it's not that big. Of course, I would want that friend to say, it's okay to move on, that you don't have to hold on to this. And yet for ourselves, sometimes we feel like we need to hold on to it, because if we don't, something bad will happen. So I think also in terms of working with regret, a number of things can be helpful. One is saying, what is in my sphere of influence? Because a lot of regret, if it's something that happened in the past, there's a lot that is not in our sphere of influence. It has already occurred. We can't go back and change that. But we might be able to say, is there anything in my sphere of influence today that I can do that could be helpful? And so being able to identify if there are any action steps I can take. Okay, that's useful. And also kind of looking at, what of this is mine to carry around? And what if this might be, because sometimes with regret, we're carrying around other people's baggage, that other people may have judged us or behaved in ways that made us feel bad at a certain point. And so to recognize, like, that's not mine to carry around anymore. So being able to let that go, I think, can be really important. And then I guess a third thing I say in terms of working with regret is this idea of stop, drop, and get curious. And I've been playing around with this a little bit. And I think, it could work for worry as well. Being able to stop and pause, so recognizing I'm stuck in this, mental habit of regret right now. I could see this way that my mind is looping around like in a dead end, and then really getting out of the head, getting out of the thoughts, and dropping more into the body. What am I actually feeling in my body? And can I be with whatever's here? Maybe there's sadness. Maybe there's loss. Can I be with whatever's here with kindness? And can I just get really curious about when I'm stuck in regret, what happens in my body? Well, I'm all contracted. I feel this heaviness. I can't move forward. If I can notice that with curiosity, it also can help to loosen the grip a little bit, to recognize, this is not helping me by holding on to this.
Yeah, 100%. That is super helpful. I think get curious is the way to move forward, because we all know we cannot change the past, yet somehow we get stuck there when we don't have any tools or we don't see any other way, which is why, the mind is so powerful, right? If we can train our mind to think of it or look at things in a different way or different light, a lot will change. It's mainly in here. So I think that, that sort of self-talk and self-education and self-work is so important. And that is regret. Now, what about worry? Because it's going to be something very similar, I would say. There would be, I would actually argue it's kind of like same but different, because with regret, you cannot change what happened. With worry is kind of like a whole different story of, oh what's going to happen. But you do know that you cannot control what is going to happen externally. You can only control what you're going to do, right? So how do we find that healthy dose? How there would be a bunch of challenges, as I could imagine. So what would be some of the challenges, and how do we find the healthy dose about, for worry?
Yeah. So again, I think it's the first step is noticing where the mind is going, because a lot of times that we're so caught in it that we don't even realize how far our mind has run away into the future. And so I think for both regret and worry, I talk about this tool, and then just to make it very concrete and simple for people, I think of the tool of a flashlight. Mm-hmm. And that when you turn the flashlight on, it illuminates a dark room. Like the obstacles might still be there if you're trying to navigate from point A to point B, but you're no longer tripping and stumbling over things. You can navigate with greater ease. And when we turn on this flashlight, which is really a metaphor for mindful awareness, and we can see the nature of our mind and the way that it's, oh my gosh, my mind is pulling me into all of these future things, then it can be this invitation to really come back to point the flashlight to say, what's actually here right now? What's actually here in this moment? Because it's a lot easier to cope with what's here now than to cope with what's here now and all of the places where the mind could run away to. I'll share a story around that. This was a number of years ago. My husband went skiing with my son, and I got a phone call from my son, and it was one of those gut feelings of like, I don't think this is a good phone call. And it turns out that my husband had fallen on the ski slope.
Oh, wow.
And he, as my son reported, he couldn't get up. He had injured his leg. And in that moment, and those moments to follow, my mind really raced forward into all kinds of what if scenarios. What if he broke something? What if he needs surgery? What if he's not going to be able to work for the next 6 weeks? What if he can't drive? And my mind just started running away to all kinds of future scenarios. And when I could catch myself and recognize that and say that all of those what if scenarios are creating a lot of additional suffering. This was an upsetting situation. But when I could catch myself, running away there and come back and point the flashlight back at like, what's actually here right now? And what was actually here right now is that he hadn't hit his head, and that my son was with them, and that the ski patrol people were with them, and that my son was going to be able to take him to the emergency room, and that he was talking, he was fine, he was going to be okay, And so, and that really helped to ground me back in the present of what's actually here right now. And so I think that's such a big one with worry, is to just look at that. And I also think another thing that's so important that can be so helpful for regret as well, but definitely with worry, is to be able to anchor our nervous system, because of that fight or flight response that gets turned on, that when our stress response gets turned on, we can't see clearly. We have a hard time seeing the big picture, or even maybe thinking clearly about how we want to move forward or what would be most helpful. And so when we can do things to calm our nervous system, and breathing is such a helpful way of calming the nervous system for some people, not for maybe, every single person, but slowing down the exhalation is really a way of calming and turning on this different part of our nervous system. It actually slows the heart rate down, sends messages to the brain that it's okay. That's just one example, but just in having and anchoring our nervous system in just being able to bring in a little bit more calm energy, we're able to sometimes face things and see things more clearly.
Yeah, 100%. It's such a powerful thing, and that is entirely within our control, right? I think it's the same for both, for both regret and worry. If anything, if you're kind of like spiraling and freaking out, I think that's just a really powerful thing to try first and foremost, just to calm your breathing. A lot of the guests on the two shows about happiness, well-being mentioned this too. If anything else is not in your control, you can control your breath. And I just find that to be so powerful. It sounds like such a small thing, and we don't talk about that very often because we take it for granted. But yeah, it's a really powerful thing that I totally agree with you. We should totally do that.
Yeah. And having other kinds of anchors can be helpful too. Like even just feeling the feet on the ground and focusing on touch points, focusing on where the body's making contact with the surface of your sitting. That can be very anchoring and calming for the nervous system as well. I think imagery can be really powerful. That can be another helpful thing to help soothe the nervous system. Because when we soothe the nervous system, we have access to more of our own inner resources about how we want to move forward. And it can help inform our choices, how we deal with worry or regret in those moments. So,
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Oh, what a powerful practice. And, we actually already mentioned a few practices ourselves, even though the practice part is incoming. So before we move on to the practice part, is there anything else you would like to cover in the concept of worry and regret and things that we can do to find those healthy dosage before we move on?
I mean, I guess I would just emphasize the self-compassion piece. That having ways of self-soothing, even just as simple as putting a hand on the heart and a hand on the abdomen, just that gentle touch can actually help to calm the nervous system, but also can be kind of a compassionate gesture towards oneself. So it's just such a simple little thing. But I think this idea of we get stuck in the narrative. I guess here's point to emphasize. We get stuck in our heads, whether it's with worry or regret, right? Or the past or the future. And when we can drop into the body and just really feel into what emotions are present. And so, maybe there's some fear that's here. Maybe there's some sadness that's here. And can I just be with the fear? Can I be with the sadness and just be present with it? Almost, I think of it like a loving parent putting an arm around a fearful child. And when we can bring that kind, or a friend, or sitting with a good friend when you're feeling upset and the friend is just present and maybe they, put a hand on your shoulder, that kind of thing. And in the presence of a compassionate other, we can feel ease, even in the midst of really difficult moments. And when we can learn to do that for ourselves, and it's hard, it's a practice for sure, it can be immensely powerful to really be able to soothe and comfort these parts of ourselves that are struggling. And that's to step out of the mental chatter and really come into the body and offer that soothing.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for that. And now let's talk about a practice that we haven't mentioned yet so that our audience can learn to find those healthy dosage of regret and worry in their lives. I mean, we've mentioned quite a few things, in the conversation before, but if there's any other practice that we haven't been able to cover and you would like to recommend to our audience, now's your chance.
Okay. So I'm going to recommend one that I came up with this acronym ABC because I wanted it to be really easy for people to remember and something you can kind of carry with you in your day. And so the A is, and this could be used, when you're just realizing that really at any time of day, but, I'm getting caught in some regret or some worry or whatever. The A is to acknowledge what's here. And again, that's really acknowledging more of the feeling of, but, and it could, the mental as well. I noticed that, I'm stuck in some regret right now. I notice that I'm feeling anxiety in my body. So it's kind of this noticing and naming. And also, and allowing and accepting. And this is part of my human condition. So this is here. I'm seeing it. I'm meeting myself right where I am. So that's the A.
Yeah.
The B is dropping into the body. So again, getting out of the chattering mind and really coming into the body and using the breath. And so slowing down the exhalation and finding anything that feels safe and soothing and stable for the body. Again, could just be feeling the feet on the ground. And so it's this kind of coming in and try to calm the nervous system. And then the C is to connect in with something that you care about and choose how you want to go forward. So in that moment, it might be, I'm starting to get pulled away by all of this worry, but I want to think about like what's here now that I care about that I can connect with. Maybe I have a family member in the next room that I want to go spend time with, or I want to work on a project that's meaningful to me or whatever. And so it's really choosing how we go forward into those next moments in a way that brings us into the present, steps us out of the mental chatter. So
that is powerful. And I love the ABC acronym because, that's so easy to remember. And hopefully, it'll stick with our audience. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So before we move on, is there anything else about this practice you would like to share with our audience?
I guess not with that particular practice. I would throw out one more thing, which is something that I call the undistraction technique. So it's just a silly little name here, but a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, I was stuck in worry, or I found myself ruminating about the past, and I did something to distract myself. I started doing a jigsaw puzzle, or I, went outside and did gardening. And I'll kind of flip it for them. And I'll say, it's really the other way around. The mental chatter is the distraction. So, because that's distracting us from our lives, right? And the going out and gardening or doing a jigsaw puzzle is actually the undistraction. It's actually engaging in something in the present moment. So just a little way to think about when we get lost in our thoughts and in our head, when we can find something that can engage our full attention right here and now. That can be really helpful to bring greater ease into the moment. So
yeah, that is also super powerful. Yeah, thank you. Instead of one, we got two practices. So thank you for that. And now let's go to your open mic. This is your floor, and we would love for you to share anything you're passionate about. I know you're super passionate about your work, and we can continue to talk about this all day.
Yes.
But I'm sure you have other things you would like to share too. So the floor is all yours. Go for it, Beth.
Oh, wow. So many things in different directions here. I guess I do want to emphasize again something that I said earlier, but just for listeners to really know that, you're not alone. And having sat with people, hundreds of people over 30 years now, I have, I feel like the privilege of meeting so many amazing people and really getting to know the way that so many people's minds work and the struggles and challenges that all of us face. And so I think that this idea of common humanity is so important and so helpful to try to hold on to, that when we are faced with worry or we're gripped by regret, just to know that, you're not alone, that there so many people are also dealing with this, that this is, a common challenge that we all face. And so just really humanizing, I think, the challenges that we all go through, and not being afraid to ask for help when some of those challenges become really bigger or when one feels really stuck. And again, as I mentioned, there were many points earlier in my life where I found going to therapy myself was really transformative for me. So I can't say enough about that. And I also think I love the idea. I have a meditation teacher who said something like, many, I remember, small moments many times. And so this idea that just looking for little ways that we can bring greater ease into our day is something that I'm really passionate about. And this idea of carrying these tools with us as we go through our day. And I'm certainly a big fan of, if you will, and practitioner of meditation, because I think cultivating a meditation practice can really help us to be aware of the nature of our mind and offers us a way to kind of step out of the grip of some of these things by looking from a more spacious vantage point of awareness itself, kind of holding what's coming up. But also, so I think there's definite, benefits of working with a meditation practice. But I also really love the idea of just these mini moments in the day that how can we bring little tools with us that can help cultivate the well-being. And going back again to this idea of gratitude, I think of one of the tools that I like to talk about is the tool that I call the magnifying glass. And it's just imagining that you could go through the day and carry around a magnifying glass with you, and that you could look for these little moments that might otherwise slip away that you could appreciate or savor. And it could be something as simple as just appreciating a really good cup of coffee that you're, drinking in that moment. Or it might be connecting with something a little bigger, like thinking about someone or something in your life that really brings you joy. But just trying to go through the day carrying around this magnifying glass, I think that's an example of these mini moments, sometimes taking 30 seconds or 60 seconds to just be able to fill ourselves up with some experience, positive, a little moment of positivity can really go a long way towards facing the bigger challenges that we have in our day. So I think that is really something that I've found helpful. And just getting into the body and out of our heads in whatever ways we can do that. I recently did a workshop called Reclaiming Your Playful Self. And I love this idea of play. I think we can really lose touch with that sometimes as we grow up.
Yeah.
Right. And
that's so true.
Being able to think about things we used to love to do as a kid, and how can we bring some of those qualities and elements into our adult lives? And I think play really brings us into our body. And so, but thinking about whatever things that really give somebody an experience of just being embodied. It could be for some people cooking, and that becomes just a whole experience of being creative, and the aromas and the smells and the experience of chopping and cutting, whatever, but things that bring us into our body, movement of all kinds, I think. So important to find ways of moving our body that feel good. So all things that I kind of think about in my own life and try to bring in.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much. There's so much to think about after this conversation. Lots of food for thought, and we really appreciate your time joining us here with us. I think our audience would also have a lot to think about themselves, and hopefully the practices that you've recommended will be taken on board, and you'll bring a lot of I would say growth, because through the journey of learning to find the right balance and the healthy doses of regret and worry, we grow a lot as humans. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, this is a conversation about growth, and you've shared a lot of wonderful insights. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great being here.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.